What No Academy Teaches, Osan Air Base, South Korea, and the Territory of Memory, 1961 through the rest of a life. The geography of this story is not fixed to a single place because what was learned did not happen in a single place. It happened over 3 years, in a series of accumulations that only assembled themselves into understanding much later, the way certain photographs require time in the darkroom before the image appears. But if you have to begin somewhere, begin here. A morning in the spring of 1961, before dawn, when a 21-year-old airman from Oklahoma walked 3 kilometers through cold Korean air to reach a dojang, before the streets were inhabited, and stood at the door in the dark and waited for the teacher to arrive. His name was then, as it had always been, Carlos Ray Norris. He would not be Chuck for several more years. The name change happened gradually after Korea, in the American life he was building in California. But the person who would become Chuck Norris was being made in Korea in those mornings and evenings, in the specific way that important things are made, not through revelation, but through repetition, not through understanding, but through the prior condition of understanding, which is willingness. He was in the Air Force because he had needed a way out of a life that was closing in on him. Ryan, Oklahoma, population, not many. A father who was gone more than he was present, and worse when present. A family that moved because debts made moving cheaper than staying. The Air Force had offered him the thing that escape always offers, a different context in which to find out who he was. He had arrived in Korea in 1958, expecting to find out, and had found instead the dojang, had found instructor Kim, whose full name was Kim Jae-jun, and who was 43 years old and had trained in Tang-Soo-do since he was 11, and who looked at the American serviceman with a gaze that was entirely empty of presumption. This is the first thing no academy teaches, and it's the most important, the gaze without presumption. It is available only to people who have made a practice of emptying themselves of their own conclusions. Kim could look at the airman and see the airman, not the American, not the serviceman, not the poor kid from nowhere, not the son of a failed man, just the person in front of him, with whatever that person contained. This is a form of respect so pure it's difficult to recognize as such, because most forms of respect require the respected party to first establish their credentials. Kim's attention arrived before credentials. It was not conditional. Norris had never been looked at that way. He didn't know what it was. He only knew that he came back. For 3 years he came back, every chance he had. Before duty shifts, after duty shifts, on weekends, in the 45 minutes between one thing and the next when another man might rest. He came back because the dojang was the only place he'd encountered where effort and outcome were an honest relationship. Where you received exactly what you put in, no more and no less, without mediation by the luck of birth or the particular prejudices of whoever was in charge. This is an extraordinary thing to find when you are 20 and poor and the son of a man who failed. It is also, as Norris would spend years understanding, only partially true. He learned the forms, the Pyongan series, the Basai, the Chinto. He learned them the way Kim taught them, which was without shortcuts and without the expectation that understanding preceded mastery. Do it again, Kim would say, and Norris would do it again. And the form that emerged from the first 100 repetitions was not the form that emerged from the first 1,000, and the form from the first 1,000 was not the form from the first 10,000, and somewhere in that accumulation the body stopped learning techniques and started becoming something. He also learned something else, and this is what no academy teaches, because it requires a context that most academies cannot provide. He learned what it feels like to be afraid, not the managed fear of competition, the controlled pre-match adrenaline that has a name and a function and that experienced fighters have protocols for. The other fear, the kind that doesn't follow the rules of competition because the situation around it doesn't follow the rules of competition. He encountered it in Korea in a way that he never spoke about comprehensively in public. The specific fear that comes from being a young American serviceman in a country that is not yours, in a region whose recent history includes a war that killed millions, in a context where the social distances between groups of young men, drunk and far from home and in possession of the specific volatility that goes with those conditions, can collapse without warning. He encountered situations in the vicinity of the base, in the town, in the complex social geography of an American military installation in a foreign country, where his training was not the main variable, where the main variable was what happened in his mind before his body was involved at all. This is what the dojang, honest about itself, eventually teaches. That technique is the last line of defense, that everything before the technique, the choices that put you in or keep you out of the situation, the awareness that reads a room the way a good driver reads traffic, the specific quality of attention that notices what is about to happen while it can still be avoided, that everything before the technique is what matters most. Jae-jun Kim had a saying that Norris heard him repeat throughout the 3 years of training. It translated approximately as, "The best fight is the one that does not happen." Americans hearing this sometimes interpreted it as pacifism or as the modest disclaimer of a man downplaying his own lethality. It was neither. It was a practical description of what mastery actually looked like in action. The master wasn't the man who won the most fights. The master was the man whose presence, bearing, and situational intelligence meant that other men, most of the time, found some reason to not start one. This could not be taught in a class. It could only be lived. And it required the specific curriculum of an actual world, not the controlled world of the dojang, where everyone has agreed to the same terms, but the uncontrolled world where the terms are set by whoever is most frightened or most drunk or most committed to a story about who they are that requires someone else's submission to confirm. Norris absorbed this curriculum over 3 years in Korea. He brought it back to California in 1962, and he built his schools on its invisible foundation, which is why his schools produced, over the decades, so many students who never used what they learned in the way that people imagine martial arts getting used, not because they were insufficiently trained, but because they had been trained well enough to keep themselves out of situations where the training was the only remaining option. This is connected to something else that happened over those years, something that cannot be separated from the Korea story, even though it belongs geographically to a different country. In 1970, Norris's brother Wieland was killed in Vietnam. He was 28 years old. He died in Quang Nam province on June 3rd, 1970, in a way that the official language of military records is both precise and emptied of meaning. He died in a country he had gone to because his country asked him to go, and he was 28, and he left a family behind him. And Chuck Norris was 30 years old and already a champion and already building something in California. And none of it prevented the specific thing that only the death of a sibling produces: the revelation that the skills you've spent your life developing have a scope limitation, that there are things they cannot reach. Norris did not talk extensively about Wieland in public. This is itself a form of communication, because what is not said about grief is often what most accurately describes its shape. He continued training. He continued competing. He won the world title again in 1970, the year his brother died. He went back to the mat, because that's what the mat is. Not an escape from the world's losses, but the one place where the relationship between effort and outcome is honest, where the body's intelligence has something to answer to, where the daily practice of discipline is a kind of argument against the randomness that takes the people you love. He brought this understanding into everything he built. Into the schools, where he told students that the point was not to become dangerous, but to become clear. Into the competition career, which he pursued with the specific intentionality of someone who knew that trophies were symptoms rather than purposes. Into the friendship with Bruce Lee, who was asking the same question from a different biography. Into the films that came later, which at their best were not about violence, but about the condition that violence is called in to resolve: injustice, cowardice, the failure of systems to protect the people they were built to protect. He was not a philosopher in the academic sense. He did not write treatises. The thinking happened in his body, in the slow accumulation of practice and failure and return to practice that constitutes a life taken seriously. When he spoke about what he'd learned, he spoke in the way that Korean teachers speak, indirectly, through story, through example, through the kind of patience that lets the student arrive at the understanding rather than delivering it like a package. In 1973, a former student named Marcus Webb came to see him in Los Angeles. Webb had been a student at Norris's school in the late 1960s, had trained seriously for 2 years, and had since moved to Portland, Oregon, where he worked as a hospital administrator. He came to Los Angeles for a work conference, and he looked up his old school and found that Norris himself was there that afternoon. They sat in the office after the class had cleared. Webb told him about a situation. Not a fight, not anything physically dangerous, but a situation at work that had required him to stand in a room full of people who were, for complex institutional reasons, invested in a decision that Webb believed was wrong, and to say clearly and calmly that the decision was wrong while understanding that saying so would cost him something. He said that he'd thought about his training during that meeting, not about any specific technique, about the breath before commitment, about the difference between reacting and responding, about being present in a situation rather than occupied by what the situation meant for him. He said, "I don't know if that's what you were trying to teach, but it's what I learned." Norris was quiet for a moment. "That's what Kim was trying to teach me," he said. Webb nodded. "Did it take you this long to learn it?" Norris thought about Korea, about the cold mornings and the darkness before dawn and the door of the dojang and the man who looked at him with the gaze that contained no presumption. About his brother, who had gone to Southeast Asia and not come back, who had lived 28 years and died in a place whose name Norris had learned to pronounce correctly in private, where nobody was watching. About the mat, the daily return to the mat, which was not triumph and was not joy, but was something more durable than either. The decision, made fresh each morning, to engage with the difficulty of becoming rather than settling into the easier business of having already become. "I'm still learning it," he said. The office held the smell of an afternoon that was ending. Somewhere in the building, a student was locking up the equipment. Outside, Los Angeles was doing what it always did at this hour, producing the specific light of a city that doesn't stop, a light that finds every surface and asks it to reflect. The best fight is the one that does not happen. The best lesson is the one that continues. The best teacher is the one who looks at you without presumption, who sees what's actually there rather than what should be, who hands you a difficulty and says, "Do it again," and means it. Not as punishment, not as repetition for its own sake, but as the only honest path between where you are and where you're capable of being. No academy can teach this. It requires a life. It requires Korea and the cold in the mornings before dawn. It requires a brother who doesn't come home. It requires a mat that is there every day, regardless of what the day has done to you. It requires a gaze that arrives before the credentials and stays after the achievements and sees, through all of it, the person. Carlos Ray Norris learned this. He went on learning it for the rest of his life. There was no certificate for it. The Dojang didn't give one. The world didn't give one. The practice was its own record. Osan Air Base, South Korea, 1958, 1962, and everything after.